Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm very happy to be there this morning to present you a piece of work we realized both at the Florence School of Regulation and Microeconomix about regulation of TSOs. We look in particular how the regulatory regimes should be harmonized in Europe to ensure their financeability. This research was motivated by the future situation of networks investment in Europe. More than 100 billion euros of investment are needed in the coming decade to upgrade the European network. This is driven by three causes represented on this NSOE map mostly. The integration of REST indicated with green lines, mostly. The achievement of cross-border interaction of the European electricity market, which is indicated with dark and light blue lines on this map, and more generally, a massive renewal of old infrastructure. Considering this huge investment effort, previous work from the Florence School of Regulation by Riccardo Galletta has shown that financeability is a key issue for TSOs to access to cheap capital. Besides, we are now in a situation where we have multinational TSOs with Elia and Tenet, and they make national regulatory frames interact. They can indeed choose in which country they use their capital depending on the characteristics of the national regulatory regimes they face, respectively in the Netherlands and in Germany, and in Belgium and in Germany. With regard to this situation, national regulations of TSOs are at a central position. It is thus fundamental to analyze potential consequences of national choices with regard to pan-European network investments. We have done so comparing national regulation in Northwest region, looking at regulatory regimes in Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. These countries are now integrated in a common market and they stand for half of European production. And for all of them, we look at the current regulatory period. We have studied these regulatory regimes looking at four properties. Considering economic literature, indeed, four properties are key to compare regulatory regimes with regard to their impact on financeability. The first property is the capability to sufficiently remunerate TSO investments. This is to ensure that the TSO invests sufficiently and avoid underinvestment. The second property is the capability to reduce TSO investment risk, tackling uncertainties with adaptable regulatory mechanisms over time during regulatory period, and reducing regulatory risk with stable regulatory rules between regulatory periods. The third property is the capability to incentivize TSO for cost efficiency, to reduce cost and avoid overinvestment. The fourth property is the capability to transfer TSO efficiency gains to final users. This is to limit, of course, monopoly rent, and the idea is to keep network tariff low. It is possible at least in the short run. We will see that it's not so easy to do in the long run. Before going further, I propose that we make a small poll with regard to these four economic properties. Considering the European situation, I launch the poll. Considering the European situation, in your view, which of the economic properties should be favored to drive regulatory regimes? So I let you vote. Remember that the first two properties makes the shareholder happy, whereas the consumer are happier with the two last properties. So more and more of you are voting. I still wait some seconds. So remember, property 1, you favor the remuneration of the TSO. Property 2, you limit the risk. Property 3, you incentivize for cost efficiency. and property 4, you favor low tariff for consumers. So still some minutes, some seconds, sorry, not for minutes. I let it open, still 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. So let's see the result of the poll. So most of you have answered it. So we have quite an equilibrate, a balanced sharing of your votes. We have 40% of people answering property 1, 45% answering property 2, and more or less the same number for property 4 and property 3, around 33%. So some of you have voted for several properties. Well, for those of you that think that incentivizing TSO cost efficiency and transferring efficiency gains to final users, well, please stay with us, because in our view it's not the main goal that should be pursued right now. And for the others, let's see which of the 5 regulatory regimes of the Northwest region follow the best property 1 and 2, and how the others should be adapted to fulfill the European goal. Before to do that, we propose to organize these 4 properties along 2 axes. The horizontal axis here illustrates an arbitrage between high remuneration for investment property 1 and transfer of efficiency gains to final users. So here we have an arbitrage between these 2 properties. And the vertical axis illustrates an arbitrage between high incentives for cost reduction and low risk for the TSO, so property 2 and property 3. Consequently, regulatory regimes located in the lower shaded part of the graph will provide high incentive for investment and shorter benefits for shareholders. At the extremes, they encompass a risk of gut plating with overinvestment. Inversely, regulatory regimes located in the upper shaded part of the graph will provide high incentive for cost reduction and shorter benefits for final users, with lower tariffs in the short term. Nevertheless, they endanger TSO financeability, and they encompass a risk of underinvestment. So now we can place the national regulatory regimes of the Northwest region, but it can also be done for other other regulatory regimes. So here we focus on the Northwest region. So if we look first at Belgium, sorry for that. In Belgium, we are in a situation where we have moderate incentive for cost reduction, a TSO facing low risk, but also low remuneration for the TSO. If we look at the case of France, there is also a moderate level of incentives for cost reduction, a low level of risk, but a higher remuneration. In Germany, we are in a different situation where the risk is quite higher because there is more incentive for cost reduction, even a high incentive for cost reduction for some parts of the cost of the German TSOs, but also a higher remuneration of the TSOs in Germany. If we look at the case of Great Britain, here the TSOs are facing high incentive for cost reduction, but also a high level of risk, and the benefit of a high remuneration. And to end with the Netherlands, they are rather in a paradoxical situation because they face quite a high level of risk with a high incentive for cost reduction, in particular on CapEx, and also on historical CapEx, most surprisingly, but they only have a quite low remuneration. All in all, when we characterize the national regulatory regimes, we notice that there are tensions between properties and regulatory design. And no regulatory model is good in all the criteria, and trade-offs are always needed. Besides, the regulatory regimes are altogether characterized by their heterogeneity. Consequently, one may wonder whether alignment or harmonization is needed at the regional level. A previous work by the think team of the FSR already shows some level of alignment is necessary at the regional level with regard to regulation for three reasons. The first one is to avoid distortion on the European electricity market, because different level of tariff may distort exchanges between the different countries. The idea is also to avoid cross-border effects, because regulation in one country could impact the cost of network companies in the other countries, because the cross-border capacity is not only decided at the interconnection on the border, but also inside national country networks. And you can also have cross-border TSO doing some arbitrage between the national regulatory regimes in order to value their capital in the countries with the most adapted, most beneficial regulatory regimes. And the last point, the last reason why it is interesting to harmonize is to have a common and friendly scheme for investors that in the end reduce the cost of capital for all the TSOs. So once we know that it is needed to harmonize the regulation in Europe, the question is to know where, what should be the harmonization target and how to define it. First of all, recall the situation in Europe. We need huge investments, imply major need for capital. And efficiency gains have been consequential in the last decades for most of the TSOs. So considering this situation, the harmonization target should be in a zone more favorable for investments. The goal is to reduce the cost of capital, because cost of investment and cost of capital will have a higher impact on network tariffs than operating costs in the coming years, because we are in a new phase of investment in the European network. So less risky regulatory regime can reduce the cost of capital, and better remuneration for TSO can ease their search for cheap capital and attract capital. Besides, the target zone should nevertheless take into account the national characteristics. The target zone should be sufficiently large to incorporate national priorities and other differences, even if harmonization may push national regulatory regimes outside their national optimum. So, after presenting our rationale, I propose to do a second poll, or the same as previously, to know whether you have changed your mind or not. So I relaunched it. So remember, property 1 is focused on remunerating TSO investment. Property 2 is focusing on risk, and property 3 is to incentivize cost efficiency. Property 4 is to favor consumers. So I let you vote. I will wait until we reach a sufficient number of people answering. Still some seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition. So now let's share the poll. So most of you now vote for property 1. There is quite a big change in with regard to a vote for property 1 and 2. You have still lots of people voting for inside devising TSO cost efficiency, and less people voting for property 4. We have 10% less than previously, whereas we have 10 to 15% more for the property 2 and property 1. So with regard property 3, in our mind, well, it should be put in the second, rather in the second trunk. So I hide the poll. In our view, the harmonization of regulatory regimes should take into account that the capability for TSOs to finance the investment is now significant and a major problem in projects of pan-European significance. And in the absence of a European regulation for cost reduction, the new EU regulatory paradigm that we propose is indeed to set the incentive for cost reduction established at the national level at a second rank in favor of pan-EU key issues such that reducing cost of capital, minimizing risky investment, and guaranteeing investment financeability. The idea is to set really a more favorable environment for regional TSOs investment. If we enter a little bit more in details, we can also answer which regulatory regimes should be adapted and how. For the case of France and Belgium, we think that first of all, financeability should be a criteria integrated in the determination of remuneration level, which is not the case presently. And for the case of Belgium, there are also a matter about the remuneration level itself, which is quite low. With regard to risk, well, these TSOs are in situation where risk is quite limited and incentive for cost reduction is sensible. So we think it should be kept as it is presently. For Germany and Netherlands, we think also that financeability should be taken into account in the determination of the remuneration. We have also a concern with regard the application of efficiency targets. They can be put on new investment, but in our mind, it's difficult to see how it can be useful to set efficiency target on historical asset base, because with this regard, the TSOs have no more possibility to impact this cost. So, and with this regard about risk, we think these TSOs are in situation where they face quite a high level of risk for two reasons. First of all, with regard to efficiency targets, they should focus on, or incentive more generally, they should focus on controllable cost only, while of course the regulators should check regularly whether the different costs are controllable or not, but we should first take care whether the TSO can really impact the cost targeted for incentives, otherwise it creates risk for the TSO. And there is also a concern about the use of benchmarking. Benchmarking, in our view, is still an informative tool. It's still not very robust. Even the regulators, for instance, in the Netherlands, admit that it's not very robust, nevertheless is used to set efficiency target, even strong efficiency target. So this is a concern for us with regard to the risk faced by the TSO. And also there is a concern with regard to integrating adjustment mechanisms to tackle uncertainty during regulatory period. With regard to Great Britain, where for financeability there is already a financeability check in the British regulatory regimes, and there is quite a risk with regard to uncertainty in Great Britain, but there are already uncertainty mechanisms to adjust the level of tariff with regard to external variables, and there should be continuing fine-tuning of this mechanism. If you want to go deeper into this topic, for first approach, you can go and read our policy brief, and if you want more detail, in particular more precision about the national regulatory regimes and their impact, you can go and see our report on this topic. So I thank you for your attention, and I welcome questions and comments with regard to this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent, for your presentation. And so we can now start with the Q&A. So, less risk and better remuneration. Which impact on tariffs do you then foresee, also taking into account the investment challenges?
There is two, in my view, a two-part response to this answer. A first response is a better remuneration. You will increase tariff in the short run for sure. But the idea is that since we are in a period where we need new investments, major level of new investments, we think that in the long term it will be beneficial to focus on better remuneration, because it will lower the cost of capital for the TSOs, and so it will reduce in a second time, in a second moment, the level of tariff. So that's the first part. And of course, if you have a lower level of risk, it will lower the cost of capital for the TSOs, and so it will lower the level of tariff in the end. So we think even if in the very short run it will increase the tariff, in the long run it's beneficial, even for consumers. And there is also one last element, is that if these investments are not done, it will impact the network quality, and so it will be detrimental to the network users. So this should also be taken into account in the whole evaluation, the whole economic evaluation.
Okay, we go to the next question. So it's the following. Regulatory regimes were built in national context, that is to say national need for investments in transmission, cost of capital for TSOs, energy gains, efficiency gains asked to TSOs. How would they impact on your results?
Well, that's for sure that when looking at the regulatory regimes, we should take into account the national specificities. And of course, when you look at regulatory regimes, you had to look at whether you are facing a private or a public TSO, because it may impact the cost of capital. You have also to take into account whether you are looking at a TSO that was investing a lot or not. So this could change a little bit the evaluation of the regulatory regimes, because the regulatory regimes may be more or less adapted to the national specificities, and most of the time they have been adapted to the national specificities. But this will not change a lot our results, more or less, with regard to the illustration that we have made. Taking into account the national context, you may have some sliding of some position, but there is no major change in the evaluation of the different TSOs. For instance, in the case of Belgium, where there was not a big focus on remuneration previously because there was not a huge level of investment needed. Whereas, for instance, in France or in Great Britain, it's now for several years that there is an increase in investment level, and that's why the remuneration level have been set so high in the national context. That's the same also for Germany. Well, it's more difficult to understand the case of the Netherlands, where the remuneration level has been set at a quite low level already in the past, or now very set a very low level, even if in the coming decade the Netherlands have to triple its asset base.
Okay. Then the following question is this one. So in your study, you propose to place incentives for cost reduction at second rank. Is it not opposed to classic results of economic literature about regulation of monopoly?
Well, it can seem indeed opposed, but in our view, it's not opposed at all. TSOs are still monopolists, and we still need to have some efficiency target to ensure that they behave efficiently. Nevertheless, we think that first of all, these targets should be set on controllable cost, and so the regulators has to take into account when they set incentives that you have that the cost of indeed controllable, even if also for non-controllable costs you have to check regularly their controllability, because this may change over time with increase over information or some informative benchmarking with regard to other TSOs, or change in technologies too. But what is not taken into account in the economic literature, generally in the theoretical model, it is that you have some kind of boom and bust cycle in investment, even in the electricity system in general, but also here in particular in the network. And so with this, taking into account that you have some investment cycle, when you are in a situation where when you have a low level of investment, you can focus on efficiency, because here the major part of the cost drive or of the manageable cost or operational cost. And here we know that cost efficiency incentive regulation is very good at limiting this kind of cost. But when you are in a situation where you need investment, where of course you can focus about put incentives on capex, but we know that incentive regulation from a theoretical point of view is not very good with controlling this kind of cost. And so it's more efficient to focus on cost of capital. And with this regard, that's why we should put more focus on remuneration right now, even if for a moment it's not totally aligned with what is in the theoretical literature, but what's again a theoretical literature that does not take into account this boom and bust cycle.
Okay, so I think we have time for a couple of more questions. So this one, how does harmonization lead to a better matching of TSO risk remuneration to specific investments like offshore, smart grids, etc.?
This, that's always the same rationale. This kind of technology needs major investments because they are completely new, and they have to be widespread to be useful for the system. And if you want to be able to invest in this kind of technology, you need capital, and so to have access to capital, you need to attract it, and to attract it, you have to be attractable, and you need to have a remuneration high enough so that the investors look in your direction and give you the needed capital for your investment. So it's not specifically related to a technology, it's more related to the fact that this technology needs some investment, and to attract capital, you have to be to have a remuneration that is sufficiently high, and your remuneration has not to be too risky also, so that you can access cheap capital, which also lower this kind of investment, because your cost of capital will enter into your cost of your cost and your tariffs at the end.
Okay, clear. And then the last question, as we are running out of time. So why do you think benchmarking should only be an information tool, whereas it seems a powerful tool for regulation to overcome their information asymmetry?
Well, I've already mentioned it very, very quickly, but in our view, for the moment, benchmarking it's not robust enough to be an output of the regulation to set the allowed revenue of the TSOs. They do not take into account very well, or it's difficult to integrate all the environmental variable that may impact the behavior of the TSO and the need of investment and the situation in which is the national context. Besides, when you are doing benchmarking of TSOs, you are generally more doing a benchmarking on the couple of the TSO and the regulation, because the behavior of the TSO is also resulting from the regulation he is facing. And generally, regulation is not controlled in this kind of benchmarking, whereas if you want to know really the behavior of the TSOs, you have to take into account that you have a TSO that is in a situation where you have a low remuneration, and another one that has a low remuneration, or he has a high incentive for cost reduction or a low incentive for cost reduction, and so on. So, and it's difficult to precisely detail the different kind of regulatory regimes you are in and how you characterize it. This is not currently, so it can be an informative tool to know how the behaviors are how the TSOs are behavioring, and how you can compare there, but from an informative point of view, to enter in negotiation with regard to between the regulator and the TSO, excuse me. But for the moment, it's not sufficiently robust to go beyond that, because the national contexts are not very well tackled.
Okay, thank you also for this answer. And even though we have many other questions, our time is now over. So I want to thank Vincent. Thank you for your contribution today.
Thank you. Bye bye.
We had more than 90 people attending live today's webinar.